It's no different really to anybody having news about anybody they know. The shock. I'm sure a lot of people were just as shocked as I was about John Lennon, or about, your Prime Minister for that matter. It's all nasty business when people get shot.
George Harrison was the soul of the Beatles, the spiritual seeker, the quiet mystic, the man who looked beyond the chaos of fame for a deeper truth. His public life was a testament to peace and meditation. But beneath that calm exterior, he harbored a bitter, lifelong hatred for one man. This was not a petty squabble. It was a cold, enduring fury born from a betrayal so profound, it helped destroy the greatest band in history. This is the untold story of the grudge the quiet Beatle took to his grave. But how could a man so dedicated to peace harbor such a venomous secret? The answer lies not in the betrayal itself, but in the years of quiet struggle that came before it. The Shadow Beatle. Before he could be betrayed by a stranger, George Harrison first had to fight for his place among his own brothers. Born in Liverpool in 1943 to a working-class family, his father a bus conductor, his mother a shop assistant, he was the youngest Beatle, the kid brother in a band of burgeoning giants. He earned his spot through sheer talent, famously auditioning for John and Paul on the top deck of a bus by perfectly playing the complex instrumental Raunchy, a feat that convinced them to let the 15-year-old join their ranks. But from that moment on, he was in the shadow of a creative supernova, the songwriting partnership of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. They were the engine, the frontmen, the twin geniuses who captured the world's attention. George was the quiet one, the lead guitarist whose incredible talent was often treated as a brilliant accessory rather than a foundational pillar. This struggle for creative oxygen defined his early years. While Lennon and McCartney churned out hit after hit, Harrison was meticulously honing his own craft as a songwriter. Yet, getting his compositions onto a Beatles record was an excruciating battle. For every masterpiece he wrote, he had to lobby, persuade, and fight just to have it included. Songs that would become timeless classics, like the cynical Taxman, the haunting While My Guitar Gently Weeps, or the transcendent Here Comes the Sun, were often met with indifference. He once recalled bringing something to a session, a song Frank Sinatra would later call the greatest love song ever written, only to have his bandmates initially dismiss it. The tension reached a boiling point during the famously fraught sessions for The White Album and Let It Be. Frustrated by Paul's domineering direction and John's creative disinterest, George temporarily quit the band, walking out of the studio and declaring, "See you around the clubs." He only agreed to return after his bandmates conceded to take his contributions more seriously. This constant fight fostered in him a fierce, almost sacred protection over his art. He wasn't just writing songs, he was carving out his identity, note by painful note, against a wall of friendly genius. This internal frustration pushed him to look for meaning beyond the screaming crowds and gold records. While the Beatles were conquering the material world, George embarked on a journey to conquer the spiritual one. A trip to India in 1966 changed him forever. He discovered the sitar, the wisdom of the Maharishi, and the profound peace of meditation. He became the band's philosophical anchor, the conduit to a world beyond pop music, even if his spiritual journey had its own complexities, including a later disillusionment with the Maharishi himself. Still, this cemented his global image. He was no longer just the guitarist. He was George, the wise, serene, and mystical Beatle. He was the one who reminded a generation that there was more to life than what you could see. And his quiet dignity became as famous as any Lennon-McCartney melody. By the late 1960s, the band was at its absolute zenith. With albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the White Album, they were not just a band. They were a cultural phenomenon, an untouchable force that had reshaped the world in their image. On stage and on record, they were gods, flawless icons at the height of their fame. They seemed invincible, a four-headed hydra of creativity and brotherhood. No one could have known that their protector, the man who had guided them from the start, was about to vanish, leaving them exposed and vulnerable to the wolf at the door. The Desperate Deal and the Devil's Handshake. At the peak of their powers, floating in a stratosphere of fame and adoration few have ever known, the real world came crashing in. In August of 1967, the Beatles were shattered by the sudden death of their manager, Brian Epstein, from an accidental overdose. The shock was seismic. John Lennon would later confess, "I knew that we were in trouble then." Epstein wasn't just their manager, he was their mentor, their protector, their confidant, and the glue that held the entire chaotic enterprise together. He handled their taxes, mediated their arguments, and shielded them from the brutal realities of the business. He was the only man they trusted implicitly. And now, he was gone. Without his steady hand, the band was a ship without a rudder, lost in a sea of its own success. Their utopian business venture, Apple Corps, became the first casualty. Intended as a haven for artists, it quickly devolved into a financial black hole, a symbol of what Paul McCartney called Western communism. The London headquarters was overrun by mystics, inventors, and hangers-on, all with their hands out. Their in-house inventor, Magic Alex, spent a fortune building a state-of-the-art studio that turned out to be completely unusable. The band was hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate, funding everything from films to fashion boutiques with no oversight. One accountant famously told them they would be bankrupt within months. The dream was turning into a nightmare. They were the biggest creative force on the planet, but they were going broke. They needed a savior. A bitter power struggle began to form within the fractured brotherhood. Paul McCartney, ever the pragmatist, championed his new father-in-law, Lee Eastman, a sharp, seasoned entertainment lawyer from New York's high society. To Paul, Eastman represented stability and professionalism. But to the other three, Eastman felt like the establishment, another suit who wouldn't understand their art or their working-class roots. John Lennon, deep in his counterculture phase, was drawn to a completely different figure, a ruthless, street-fighting manager from New Jersey named Alan Klein. Klein was infamous. He was a pit bull who had represented Sam Cooke and the Rolling Stones, known for his forensic audits of record labels and his brutal negotiation tactics. His slogan was, "I don't play the game, I change the rules." He was everything the polished Eastmans were not. Here lies the core of the tragedy. The moment the future was sealed. It was George Harrison who became Klein's deciding champion. Klein, a master manipulator, reportedly showered George with the attention and respect he had craved for years. He praised his songwriting, telling him he was criminally undervalued compared to John and Paul. For Harrison, feeling increasingly patronized by Paul's take-charge attitude, Klein's validation was intoxicating. He saw an ally, a fellow rebel who spoke the language of the street. With a quiet conviction, he swayed a reluctant John and a loyal Ringo to his side. They voted to hire Alan Klein, overriding Paul's furious objections. In a tense meeting that Paul refused to attend, the other three signed the contract, making the division physically real. In that moment, George Harrison believed he had saved the band. In reality, he had just signed its death warrant. His trust was catastrophically, horrifically misplaced. He soon discovered that Alan Klein was not a savior, but a shark. Klein immediately set to work, and his methods were brutal. He fired trusted employees, alienated business partners, and, most critically, began to restructure the band's finances in ways that allegedly funneled enormous sums of money into his own accounts. He took control of their precious songwriting catalog, the very soul of their creative output. The man George had brought in to unite them only deepened the rifts, turning brother against brother with whispers and manipulations. George Harrison, the spiritual seeker, had to face a horrifying truth. He had personally invited the devil into his home, and now that devil was systematically burning it to the ground. The betrayal was absolute. A fury that never faded. With Alan Klein at the helm, the internal fractures within the Beatles became gaping, irreparable wounds. The dream was well and truly over. The atmosphere in the studio, once a place of magic, turned toxic with paranoia and resentment. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The band that had defined a decade crumbled into dust, not with a gentle fade.
A week ago today, 3 of the original 4 Beatles, John, George, Paul and Ringo, finally parted company with their fast-talking American manager, Alan Klein. A highly significant announcement for pop fans because one of the reasons given for the original breakup of the Beatles was that after Brian Epstein's death, John, George and Ringo wanted Klein to manage the Beatles' complex business affairs and disagreed with Paul,
but with the ugly screech of lawsuits and accusations. In a move that horrified the world, Paul McCartney was forced to take the traumatic step of suing his own bandmates in the British High Court. His lawsuit listed John, George, and Ringo as defendants. It was the only legal way he could dissolve the Beatles' partnership and finally extricate himself, and them, from the iron grip of the man George had championed. Their private financial details and creative disagreements were aired in public, turning their art into a commodity to be fought over. The Brotherhood was officially dead, killed by the poison of betrayal. In the aftermath, the quiet Beatle was quiet no more. George Harrison, who had once sought inner peace above all else, now had a new mission: to wage a public war against Alan Klein. For the rest of his life, he was relentless and venomous in his condemnation. He called Klein a con man, a crook, and the biggest bastard he had ever met. In countless interviews, he laid the blame for the band's destruction squarely at Klein's feet.
Yeah, well, I didn't really think about it. I just felt time to make a record.
Using his global platform to warn other musicians to stay away from him at all costs. The man who once spoke of universal love now spoke with a focused, surgical hatred. His words were a weapon, and he aimed them directly at the man who had violated his trust. Even his music carried the scars. His iconic song, "Beware of Darkness," is widely seen as a spiritual warning inspired by the darkness he saw in Klein. The battle wasn't just fought in the press. The legal and financial war against Klein dragged on for nearly a decade, a bitter and soul-crushing ordeal that kept the wounds of the breakup raw and festering. The shadow of Klein's influence even tainted Harrison's greatest humanitarian triumph: the concert for Bangladesh. Financial mismanagement by Klein's company reportedly delayed millions of dollars from reaching the starving refugees the concert was meant to help, a fact that deeply pained Harrison for years. It was a brutal lesson. The experience left him deeply cynical about the music industry and obsessively protective over his own affairs. His film company, Handmade Films, was born from this cynicism. He founded it to save Monty Python's Life of Brian after the original backers pulled out, becoming an accidental movie mogul purely because he wanted to ensure artists weren't at the mercy of suits. It was his creative and financial revenge. Even after the lawsuits were settled, even after decades passed, Harrison's hatred never softened. It was the one grudge he refused to release. In the 1990s, during the production of the Beatles anthology project, the old legal wounds were reopened, a constant, ugly reminder of the feud. For a man who dedicated his life to spiritual enlightenment, meditation, and letting go of earthly attachments, his animosity towards Klein was a startling contradiction. It was a cold, hard stone of anger that he carried with him until his death from cancer in 2001.
Another major story tonight is the passing of George Harrison. The former Beatle died in Los Angeles from cancer, his family by his side. He was 58 years old. Harrison's life and music reached for the same notes, inner strength and inner peace, and struck a chord with millions. CBS's Mark Phillips reports on the death and life of George Harrison.
Alan Klein became the symbol of everything corrupt and greedy that he despised in the world, the one person for whom his expansive spiritual beliefs could offer no peace and no forgiveness. We began with the myth of the quiet Beatle, an icon of peace who seemed to float above the messy conflicts of the world. We discovered instead a man of fierce, unshakable principles, whose trust was so profoundly broken that it ignited a righteous anger that burned for over 30 years. His lifelong war with Alan Klein reveals that his famous quietness was never passivity. It was a deep well of conviction. He fought for his creative voice against his own bandmates, only to be seduced into signing it away to a wolf in sheep's clothing. That devastating mistake forged the fiercely independent artist he would become. His hatred was not just a personal grudge, but a moral stand against the greed and exploitation that he believed had poisoned his life's work and destroyed his family. This leads to a final, thought-provoking question. In the end, did holding on to this one epic grudge make George Harrison a hypocrite in his spiritual journey? Or was it the ultimate, unwavering proof of his integrity? He was the spiritual Beatle who sought harmony with the universe, but in the face of absolute betrayal, his quiet nature gave way to a fury that never faded. So, what's the final verdict? Was George Harrison's unwavering grudge a moral failure, or the ultimate proof of his integrity? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. We read every single one. And if you want to uncover the next hidden truth behind a rock and roll legend, do us a favor and hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.